I started out making this as one video and it's going to become a series. Lately, I've been watching so many birth stories show up in my subscription feed because there's been a baby boom and I've been having a really fun time watching those. It has inspired me to share my birth stories. My blog readers know this, but I'm not sure that I've ever mentioned here on the vlog that I've actually had 5 C-sections. I'm gonna start at the beginning with the first one. It was not planned. If you are pregnant, if you might be having a child in the near future, this would be the one to skip. If you just want to skip on to number 2, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are not traumatic. Number 1 is the one where things are a little bit intense and the C-section isn't bad, but everything that led up to it makes it a little bit amazing that we had more than one child. So actually it makes me really thankful that Sadie and I are both here today. So here is my first birth story. I went into labor the day before I hit 40 weeks pregnant. It felt like I was enormous. I kept asking my doctor if she thought that the baby was going to be big, and she kept laughing and saying, I think that she's absolutely perfect. We would find out in hindsight that this was actually not what she really thought, but she was saying that to reassure me, and I'm thankful for that. So my water broke at home and we went to the hospital. The hospital was an hour and a half away from where we lived. That would be the closest hospital that delivered babies, was an hour and a half away from where we lived. My water broke and my contractions started on pretty quickly. By the time that I realized that my water really had broken, because it was not, when my water broke it wasn't like a huge amount, it was just a tiny bit because her head was in the way. It took me a little bit to really be convinced that my water had broken, and the way I was convinced that it had broken was that the contractions that I'd been having for weeks suddenly became very, very much more painful. So I was like, you know what, I think that my water really did just break, that pop, because it was like a pop and then just a little trickle. I was like, could that really have been it? It was more the pop that I thought was it than the trickle. We got in the car. By then the contractions were like 3 to 4 minutes apart, and we drove the hour and a half in, and they checked me and I was 4 centimeters, which I had been for like a month, and they could tell that my water was broken. So they admitted me. Everything went really fast and really smoothly. I pretty quickly went to 8 centimeters, and then everything just stopped at 8 centimeters. And part of the story, I knew that I did not want to do this whole natural childbirth thing. I'd taken the class, I'd looked into my options. I wanted an epidural. I was not going to be a hero. At least I didn't think I was. I was. So I got my epidural and everything moved along quickly for several more hours, and then it all just ground to a stop. Labor stopped. The nurse came in and said that because it had been stopped for a while, they were going to start on some Pitocin to start things back up again. So they did, and still doing fine. Quickly things start back up and I get to 10 and it's time to push. I push a couple times and she immediately starts having decels of her heart. Her heart rate starts dipping every time I push. So they tell me to stop. The nurse tells me that she is going to turn the epidural off for an hour and then we're going to try to push again. So this is what happens. They turn the epidural off for an hour, and then when I can really feel things again, and I'm really feeling things now after an hour without the epidural, I start to push. And no more decels of her heart after an hour, and I push for 2 hours. And that nurse goes off. She was really great, and she had been there the whole time, but her shift is now over. And so she goes home, and when she left, she said to my mom in the waiting room, she said she was just worried because my pelvis was so small. Just so small. And also Sadie was sunny side up, so she was facing, her head was facing outwards, like towards my belly button. 2 hours of pushing, new nurse comes on, brand new, very, very young. She's talking about the tests that she's taking and just taken and studying for. But okay, I mean, they wouldn't have her in there if she didn't know what she was doing, right? And so we start, I keep pushing and pushing, and at the 3-hour mark I asked her if she could please go get my doctor because I just had a feeling that something was wrong, and she said no, that there was no way she was going to be waking my doctor up for no reason. I had only been pushing for a little bit. I needed to push for longer before she was going to be getting my doctor for me, and I think in her mind it was like I'd only been pushing for an hour because she'd only gotten there an hour ago. The other thing was, my doctor was just this very stern, strict woman. I loved her, but a lot of people at the hospital, as I would learn over that pregnancy and over the next pregnancy were really, really intimidated by her. And this brand new nurse was not about to go into the room and wake her up. I pushed for another hour, so I'm up to 4 hours of pushing. The epidural's been turned off the whole time. At some point I felt this terrible stinging in my back and I knew that it had pulled out. The doctor's still not here, and all of a sudden my doctor, comes into the room. She's woken up on her own. It's like 8:30 now, and she comes into the room. She asks how long I've been pushing, and the nurse says like 2 hours. Which I'm so out of it that I can't even tell her that that's not right. I can't even tell time anymore. I don't even know. I figured out how long I'd been pushing later on when I actually found out what time she was born at, and I realized that it was 5 hours after I started pushing, because I knew what time I started pushing at. My doctor comes into the room and she has me use the bar, which I'd used a ton. I've been up all these different positions that they had me pushing in. She has me push once with the bar, and she has me push 2 times, and she says, we need to do a C-section. And she's looking concerned. Not scared, not like it's going to be an emergency, but like this is definitely a C-section. She turns around and says to the nurse, you need to turn the Pitocin off now. And she walks over and turns the knob. And at that point, they try to turn my epidural back on. And I had already said, I think I pulled my epudural out. And everyone says, no, you didn't pull your epidural out. That doesn't happen. And then they try to turn it on and nothing happens. And they're like, oh, you pulled your epidural out. And so they say, we were gonna have to wait for anesthesiology, which obviously we would have had to wait for anesthesiology anyways, but now we're gonna have to wait for anesthesiology without an epidural until they get there. And there are 8 people in front of you because this is an emergency C-section at this point. So I'm laying there and the nurses turned the Pitocin off and they leave the room, and it's me and Paul. I am laying there looking at the drip, 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 and it's dripping so fast. I think that it's saline. That's why I don't say anything. But the contractions are getting so hard. The contractions just keep getting harder and harder and harder until I cannot feel an end between the contractions. And that is how the next hour passes, because it takes an hour for the anesthesiologist to get to me. And when he comes in and sees me, he just starts apologizing and apologizing. And I'm just sobbing. At that point, I was just sobbing nonstop. I'm gonna die, I'm gonna die, I'm gonna die. And my doctor comes into the room and she looks at the IV and she starts yelling at the nurse that she had told her to turn it off, not up. Now, at our current hospital in our current town, they have like these fancy machines where you have to put the numbers in and you have to confirm that you're turning it up or down, and it's telling you the amount that you're turning it up and down. This was not that. This was like a knob that you twisted, and she had twisted it the wrong way and she had turned the Pitocin up and not down. And so I had been on like a bunch of Pitocin for the last hour instead of no Pitocin for the last hour. And at that moment, the woman who taught the birthing class I was in comes into the doorway, and it was because she had come on shift and she'd walked past my parents, and my mom said, Cammy's in there and I think something's wrong. And so she came running over and she comes in and asks to be in there. And the other nurse, who was the one who just made the Pitocin error, says, can I be in on this surgery? And the doctor throws her out of the room. And I'm just still sobbing at this point because there's like no end between contractions. They're moving me down to the OR. Now they have to do a spinal because the epidural is pulled out. And so the nurse who is my birthing coach holds me while I'm having a contraction. While in the middle of the contraction, they put the spinal in because there's no time when I'm not having contractions. Right before that happens, I feel this huge, gigantic rush of fluid, and it feels like the baby moves down like a little bit, and then they do the spinal, and then finally everything just goes blessedly numb and I finally can't feel anything anymore. And they do the surgery, and when the doctor does the surgery, they said that she was surprised because when she made the incision, it was directly over Sadie's mouth when she did the cut, and there was Sadie's mouth right there. And she pulled her back and it scraped Sadie's head on my pelvis, and there was like a bloody spot where it was scraped. And so 5 hours after I started pushing, she was born, and she was 9 pounds 4 ounces and 22 inches. And I was told by about 4 doctors that we both would have died if it hadn't been for our C-section. And I fully believe that that is true, that we both would have died because there was no way she was coming out without the C-section. And my recovery with Sadie was so hard. just recovering from the 5 hours of pushing and being in labor, and then recovering from the not emergency, but the unplanned C-section on top of that was really, really hard. I got sent down, they didn't have any rooms in the maternity ward, so I got sent down to a pediatric ward where I was put in a little pediatric room, and she was with me the whole entire time. And I remember just like trying to nurse her and care for her and being a mess myself. It was hard. It was really hard for several months afterwards. I was in pain for months and months after I had her, and I thought that was just how C-sections were. I would hear people say that they wanted a C-section, because I've heard people say this, and I heard people after my C-section say that they wanted a C-section because it was easier, and I thought they were insane. I couldn't imagine anything less true. If you liked this video, I would love it if you'd give it a thumbs up. And if you're interested in all things autism, which is what we usually talk about around here, I'd love it if you would hit subscribe, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.